I'd like to introduce myself and my colleague before we get started. I'm Dr. Caitlin Keranen. I'm a professor of history here at Eastern. I publish research on the history of United States foreign policy, and I teach classes on subjects that are very much related to our topic today, the history of U.S. foreign policy and the history of the United States in the Cold War. My colleague, Dr. Scott Moore, is an associate professor of history here at Eastern. He has published research on multi-ethnic civic education in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's a specialist in Central and Eastern European history, and he teaches courses that are directly related to this talk as well, including a history of Russia, history of Eastern Europe, and seminars on totalitarian states and the threat to democracy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Moore. He's going to speak for the longest, since this is mainly a European conflict. He's going to provide that context, and then I will come at the end and offer some remarks about why it matters to us in the American history context. So, Dr. Moore.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Keranen, for that introduction, and thank you to all the people she mentioned, because we really did need all of them to pull it together really fast, like in a day. And so I guess the most important part of today's talk is to try to help contextualize the moment that we're in right now, to offer some historical background, historical understanding, while also realizing that with any sort of present moment, it's hard to be able to know exactly what's going to happen, to exactly have everything 100% right. But we can, I think, look at history, we can look at sort of information we have to try to make as much sense of the present moments as we can. Last Monday, February 24th, Russia launched an invasion of Ukraine. For weeks, Russia had been accumulating forces on the Ukrainian border, making unfounded and completely untrue allegations that Ukraine was involved in genocide against the Russian-speaking population of eastern Ukraine. Prior to the invasion, Russia also took the provocative step to recognize two breakaway regions in Ukraine that had received long-standing Russian backing over the past decade or so. And these regions had been under Russian control and backed by Russian separatists. And the recognition attempted to provide what we could, I guess, think of as the most bare of fig leaves to try to justify Russia's aggression against Ukraine. However, the scale of the Russian invasion, which was not concentrated on the border regions that it had been talking about, but a full-scale invasion of the full Ukrainian country, reveals that Russia's ambitions, I think, go beyond just simply even that fig leaf of support for Russian-speaking separatists. The best intelligence that the European Union and the United States have been able to gather is that originally the most ambitious hope was to topple the democratically elected government of Ukraine, and at a minimum install a Russian-backed puppet regime that could then tie Ukraine into Russia more fully. The fierce resistance of Ukrainians has frustrated these efforts, and ultimately the future of the conflict is both dangerous and unpredictable. Russia's attack on Ukraine is one of the most serious crises that Europe's faced since the Second World War. And beyond just being a war in Ukraine, it represents a direct challenge to an international system that has secured peace and prosperity in Europe since the end of the Cold War, but you could argue going back even to the Cold War. And this international system acknowledges the intrinsic sovereignty of nations, the rights of those nations to determine their own futures, their own governments, and their own destiny, and the fact that countries have the right to determine their own international commitments, alliances, and rejects the use of force to resolve disputes or to change borders. And so while it might seem a conflict in a far-off area in a region that might be thought of as potentially unstable, the attack on Ukraine is a very serious challenge that I think the world has begun to acknowledge. I do want to mention, as we look at this map, which shows the best estimates of the gains that Russia has made into Ukraine, like all maps, they are abstractions. Even though the red shaded regions are areas that are assumed to be under nominal Russian control, it's hard to know exactly how much of those red shaded regions are actually under Russian control, as opposed to, let's say, just roadways or things like that. But The prevailing interpretation, if we want to look at sort of the origins of this crisis, we have to go back to, I think, the end of the Cold War, because this crisis is really the crisis produced by one individual, and that's the Russian ruler Vladimir Putin. And to understand his view of both Ukraine and the world, we really have to go back to the end of the Cold War itself. This is a picture I use in a lot of my classes. I think if you were to write a history of the Cold War or a history of the late 20th century, the image of people on the Berlin Wall is one of the most iconic historical moments of the recent past. And if you were to look at interpretations of this moment, overwhelmingly, they tend to be discussions of optimism, of hope, of change. If you watch documentaries, if you listen to people that were at that moment, it was a moment where the thought was tyranny is collapsing in Europe, the potential for freedom to Europe, the full continent of Europe, not just the western part, is now a possibility. The idea that you could overcome the Iron Curtain and the division that had gripped Europe for the last 50 years was finally coming to an end. And so this moment was greeted by optimism, hope, and inspiration. It's also worth pointing out, though, that for a segment of the population in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe, this was not a moment of optimism, that this was a moment of deep despair. And I think that we have to sort of look at the perspective or the mentality of Vladimir Putin, who was actually in East Germany as a KGB officer as communism was collapsing. And far from being inspired by the people who were protesting and the people who were taking control of their government and their destiny, he was busy burning the files of the KGB that were in the office there, hoping that dissidents and protesters wouldn't get a hold of them. And for Vladimir Putin, who is very deeply committed to, if not communism as an ideology, he was deeply committed to the principle that nations are best secured by strong authoritarian leaders and that people are controlled and their destinies hemmed in by those leaders. And that moment in 1989 seemed to prove to him the dangerous power that popular protest and the power of the people could pose to those systems. And so ultimately, these protest movements brought down the communist regimes. And this sense of despair was made even more palpable when the Soviet Union itself broke apart in 1991. Following the collapse of communist regimes in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union's grip on power within its own territories began to erode. And ultimately, by 1991, it broke into a series of successor states, which you can see here. Obviously, the largest successor state to the Soviet Union was Russia. But if you look, there are literally over a dozen different countries that gained their independence with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine being one of them. Ultimately, and from the perspective of Vladimir Putin, and he has actually said this, the breakup of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe. In fact, he even went so far in 2000 and the early 2000s to call it the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And if you think about 2 world wars and a Cold War, I think it says a lot about his mentality that he ranks this as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And I think to understand what he means by that, we have to understand what, for people like him, this moment meant. It wasn't people gaining control over their own destinies. It was Russia losing global influence, global prestige, and losing a global empire, an empire that it has largely been building since the 17th century. And so for Vladimir Putin and for people that think in the mentality that he thinks, this is a moment where Russia lost its power and its influence on the world stage. The intervening decade of the 1990s only compounded this sense of loss and despair, considering the fact that Russia's transition from communism was at best rocky. If you were to look in the 1990s, Russia ended up transitioning into a capitalist system and a democratic system that was marked by chronic corruption, chronic cronyism, rampant organized crime, massive levels of unemployment and economic instability, to the point where by the time you get to the end of the 1990s, Russia was largely in the hands of a group of individuals we can collectively refer to as oligarchs. exceptionally wealthy individuals that largely benefited from the transition to, or the breakup of the Soviet Union, largely by pillaging Russia and its economic potential. There's a deep irony to the fact that many of these oligarchs were, in the previous decade, communist leaders committed to the theoretical idea of economic equality, though the Soviet Union had largely abandoned that sort of commitment by the end. And so Vladimir Putin ended up becoming the acting president of Russia in 1999. And over the course of the 1990s into the 2000s, further felt Russia humiliated by the expansion of the European Union. Here you can see the map of countries that now belong to the European Union. This expansion occurred in a gradual series of steps. There was a series of expansions in the mid-90s. There was another around 2004, most recently in 2013. If you were to notice, the expansion of the European Union included several countries that were in the Soviet orbit during the Cold War in Central and Eastern Europe, and even more humiliatingly from the perspective of Soviet nostalgists like Putin, includes former Soviet territories like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This expansion of the EU corresponded with an expansion of NATO that Dr. Karenin is going to talk about. And for, again, folks that think in the mentality of Vladimir Putin, this represented a deep intrusion on what is seen as Russia's territory in the world. Far from seeing the European Union as a collection of independent states committed to a common and prosperous economic and political future, he sees it as an intrusion of the West into territory that is rightfully Russia's. As I mentioned, he became president in 1999, first made acting president, later elected to a full term, and he actually, ironically, ended up coming to power promising to be a reformer. He actually promised to end corruption, to try to bring a degree of stability economically and politically to Russia. And on the surface, in his first handful of years in power, he appeared to be doing that. He took a series of provocative steps to try to defang the power of the oligarchs and made a series of very important changes to Russia's economy, military, in an effort to try to make it seem more stable and more predictable. In reality, behind the curtain, what he was doing is essentially setting the groundwork for eroding Russia's democratic system and accumulating his own power. He did break the power of the oligarchs of the 90s, but did so by essentially creating a whole new class of oligarchs that were deeply beholden to him. And if you were to look at the Russian system as it developed in the 2000s, there was a very blurred line between their political leaders and their economic elite. There were a series of corporations that were state-owned, but there were also corporations that were governed and directed simply by government officials. And all of these officials earned exceptional amounts of wealth, essentially pillaging Russia for its own benefit. And they owed all of their wealth and status directly to Putin, which created a foundation of support for him. Over the course of the 2000s, he began developing what he cynically referred to as quote-unquote managed democracy. Think back to what I was talking about 5 minutes ago. He is deeply contemptuous and deeply distrustful of people, of the power of people to control their own destinies. And so as a result, he sees democracies at best as an institution to be managed. And what managed democracy actually means is an authoritarian system, but one that allows, for example, for exceptionally token opposition leaders to maybe protest a little bit in the elected assemblies. But also, if you were to look over the course of the 2000s, he began developing control over the media, developing control over academia, essentially ensuring that there was no legitimate form of dissent that could actually challenge his rule. Probably the most insidious and nefarious aspect of his accumulation of power is the number of opposition leaders, journalists, academics, and critics who mysteriously die under unexplainable circumstances that are directly linked to him, in the sense that there's no question at all that these mysterious deaths were ordered by him and carried out by those within his government. Most recently, he obviously tried to employ some of these tactics to poison his most important opposition leader. And when that didn't work, when the opposition leader actually lived, he took the step of having him arrested the second he returned to Russia, so that way he couldn't legally run for election, which is another tactic that Putin has used when elections occur to try to minimize dissent, is anybody who might actually win to defeat him is arrested on trumped up charges that had no merit, so that way they could then not run. As we look at other aspects of Putin's regime, it's also been characterized by intense levels of imperial nostalgia. And when I say imperial nostalgia, I don't just mean a sort of longing for the old days, but actually a desire to go back and actually reconstruct the old days. We can see this very superficially, and by that I mean in the visual aspects of Russia, by the level of grandiose, ostentatious construction projects he's built to try to echo visions of Russia's imperial past. Here you can see the world-famous Bolshoi Ballet, which was restored and reinvigorated under his regime. If you were to look at the very, very top, one of the most important changes that occurred was the replacing of the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union with the symbol of the old Russian Empire, the double eagle, which has also been used to much fanfare under Putin's regime. Though the most important part of this imperial nostalgia is a deep desire to not only reclaim what Putin sees as rightfully Russian territory and unfairly taken from Russia, but also to actively engage in efforts to enhance Russia's status on the world stage. And in this regard, if you were to think about his political positioning and his political thinking, he doesn't accept the post-war order that I've discussed already, this idea that countries are free and independent to choose their own standing in the world. Instead, he sees it in a much older-fashioned way of the world is divided into spheres of influence with great powers that have control over those spheres, and that other powers should not interfere in them. This worldview obviously diminishes any acceptance of the autonomy or the agency of the places within those imperial spheres. And we can see him acting to cultivate this through actions not just in Ukraine, but in other regions of Central and Eastern Europe as well. One of the ways that he has worked to solidify this revival of Russian power is through the subversion of democratic systems in the former Soviet Union, utilizing the full range of Russia's intelligence power, economic power, and political influence to actively support those who would also seek to have those managed democracies. And he's had a range of success depending on the country. So for example, currently he has succeeded enormously in Belarus, where he's essentially been able to prop up a government that reflects very much his own structure. And he has had mixed success in regions, for example, like Georgia and Ukraine. And I'll talk more about the Ukrainian situation in a second. If we were to look over the sort of course of the last decade or so, in 2011, there were a series of protests in Russia that were the most significant challenge to Putin's control over the state, really since he took over. There was the sort of illusion of an election that was so obviously fixed that a series of Russian opponents went out to the street. In Putin's mind, this was not only an echo of the dangerous moments of 1989, where it displayed the destructive power of the people, but he also saw it as a grand conspiracy designed by the West to bring down his rule. And in this regard, all gloves were off from Putin's perspective. And even though he had been engaged in these activities before, after 2011, he intensified his efforts to undermine democratic systems, not just in Eastern and Central Europe, but wherever they happen to be. And if you were to look over the past decade, Russia has used the full extent of its abilities to try to support extremist movements in Europe and the United States, to undermine elections in Europe and the United States, and to cultivate a collection of leaders that, again, support his sort of vision of the way managed democracies should be. And again, he's had a range of success. For example, Hungary has transitioned to a quasi-authoritarian regime over the past decade, and he's had marginal success in propping up anti-democratic extremist movements elsewhere. Again, probably the area where he has had the most interest has been in Ukraine, where he's had mixed success in doing these activities. Ukraine, like Russia, had a very rocky road after the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of the things I mentioned, whether it was corruption, the development of oligarchy, all took place in Ukraine as well. Putin has actively worked to support pro-Russian authoritarian-style leadership in Ukraine. However, he's also faced mixed success. For example, in 2004, after a flagrantly fixed election took place, pro-democratic protesters took to the streets in the so-called Orange Revolution and were able to essentially force a new election that was able to actually more accurately reflect the desires of the Ukrainian people. One thing that I think is worth pointing out, and it's something we'll talk about more during the Q&A session, is Ukraine itself has a very sort of clear split when it comes to people that want to see it gravitate more toward the European Union and the West, and people that actually want it to still be tied more to Russia, if not necessarily the style of government Putin supports. Here you can see the vote of the so-called Orange Revolution, and you'll notice that while the western portion of the country is firmly in the favor of the pro-Western candidate, there's substantial legitimate support for the pro-Russian candidates in the East. And so Putin was able to essentially continue to cultivate and develop support utilizing, again, this sort of legitimate tension for those that wanted to see Ukraine sort of move in different directions. And I think nothing illustrates this sort of divide more than the fact that in a completely or in a largely fair election, after the Orange Revolution, the pro-Russian candidate won and was able to actually gain the presidency of Ukraine. However, once again, after that election, there was efforts to try to rig the election explicitly and flagrantly. And in 2014, this actually ended up producing another wave of protests that actually moved into violent challenges to the pro-Russian government. In this case, Ukraine again had a pro-Western government put into place, humiliated, enraged, and angered by the failures of his efforts to secure a pro-Russian candidate. Vladimir Putin began drumming up challenges to Ukraine's sovereignty and ultimately seizing control of the peninsula of Crimea, while also developing a separatist movement in the eastern regions of Ukraine. Since 2014, these separatist regions have received exceptional levels of financial, military, and political support from the Russian government, to the point where oftentimes their military forces were largely thought to be Russian military forces in different uniforms. And so this has been a base of support where Russia has waged a de facto war against Ukraine since 2014, just nothing on the scale that we're witnessing now. And so ultimately what we're currently experiencing now is really the last volley in his effort to try to seize control over Ukraine's destiny. And I think the fairest question to ask is why now and what does he hope to achieve? And the only thing that I can say to try to bring any sort of logic to a war of this magnitude is that far from being a military threat to Russia, Ukraine, it cannot possibly be a significant military threat to Russia. Instead, the threat Ukraine poses is the fact that it has become increasingly more pro-democratic over the last decade. And that should a pro-democratic Ukrainian government succeed, that is a direct, intimate threat to Vladimir Putin's vision of managed democracy or authoritarian rule. Because ultimately that style of leadership relies on cynical beliefs that things can't possibly be better. And ultimately, if people in his own country and in Belarus and in the rest of the region can look across the borders and see it can be, that's an intrinsic threat to the worldview that he's promoting. And I'll let Dr. Keranen talk a little bit more about the Western response and the NATO response.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. I'm going to very briefly try to give some context for how the United States fits into this picture. And I always tell my students that you have to be careful about making easy historical analogies. Every bad guy in history is Hitler, et cetera, and that's not very good history. But I think in this particular case, we have two examples in U.S. foreign policy that provide us with some pretty useful historical analogies when it comes to foreign policy. And one is the trend of isolationism and appeasement of the 1930s, and the other is the idea of containment during the Cold War. So most of American, well, not most, but much of American history has been guided by, in terms of foreign policy, the idea of isolationism, a very powerful thread in American foreign policy. And if you think about it, that makes sense. 1776, tiny little country, not a very large military. Europe was far more powerful. We didn't have a standing army. So minding our own business, so to speak, and staying on our side of the pond made a lot of sense for a young and struggling country. And that became a really powerful idea in a lot of American history, leading with some exceptions, for example, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, until 1917, when Woodrow Wilson entered the United States into the First World War with the claim that this was to make the world safe for democracy. It became very apparent immediately after the war that that lofty goal had not been achieved. The world was certainly no safer for democracy. The United States decided that it had been a mistake to be involved in World War I and retreated into a very powerful foreign policy isolationism, thinking that we had learned the right historical lesson. Don't get involved. In the 1930s, even as dark storm clouds of war were gathering in Europe and in Asia, that isolationist impulse remained very, very powerful. And it led to a very powerful political lobby group called America First to advocate that the United States stay out of Europe. And it included celebrities at the time like the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, who openly praised Hitler as a forceful and powerful leader. Of course, World War II shattered the idea that we could remain isolated from the rest of the world. That's all I'm going to say about World War II. It was an absolute and total game changer for the world and for the United States. We realized that we no longer had geographic protections of oceans and that the world would pull us into conflicts whether we wanted to be there or not. After the war was over, 50 million people were dead. 50 million people were dead. And the United States had to think about how it was going to be involved in the world. And at the same time, another conflict was brewing, even in the ashes of the end of the Second World War, and that was the clash between democracy and communism. The superpowers that came out of World War II, obviously the United States and the Soviet Union, had very different ideas about world stability and security, to put it mildly. The United States believed the world would be safer if more countries were democratic, if free trade was available to everyone. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had endured major European invasions into Soviet or Russian territory in the last 50 years that resulted in enormous casualties to the Russian and the Soviet people. So Stalin was understandably concerned about security. But his reaction to how to make the Soviet Union more secure was pure violence. Once the Red Army was in place in countries across Europe, it did not leave. And so the United States realized that it was confronting something that it was going to have to figure out how to deal with. And it was concerned about the Soviet threat. The Soviet Union refused to leave these countries. In the example of Poland, it executed the political elite that posed a challenge to Stalin. And so the United States tried to come up with some kind of idea about how to engage the Soviet Union in this context. George Kennan, a diplomat living in the Soviet Union, proposed something that became gospel truth for American foreign policy for the duration of the Cold War, and that idea was containment. He said, we have to, quote, contain Soviet expansionist tendencies. Now, Kennan's goal in containment was to avoid war. He wasn't advocating for war, but he also talked about the need to stand up to Stalin every single time until Stalin was willing to back down, and almost every single time that worked. But we didn't just leave it to containment in that respect. We also believed that we had to create a defensive organization that would provide protection for not just the United States, but for all the countries of Western Europe that had embraced democracy and were trying to fend off the communist assault from the East, and that was NATO. NATO is a military and political alliance that is intended to provide an umbrella defense for Western democracies, with the understanding when it was formed in 1949 that the United States was the leader of the free world and had the capability to protect other democracies. But the umbrella defense idea is expressed in Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which is an attack against one is an attack against all. That is the power of NATO. And part of the push for NATO came in the beginning of the Cold War after Stalin proved that he was willing to starve 2.5 million West Berliners to death by erecting a blockade around West Berlin to prevent the Americans from being able to supply the Germans after World War II. So we understood, of course, the terms and why NATO was so important. Something that's really important to think about with NATO, first of all, there were 12 original countries, and now it's expanded to 30. We can talk about those countries in the Q&A if you're interested. But NATO countries wanted to be members of NATO. They asked to become members of NATO. This was not something that the United States forced upon them. They understood the United States was more powerful than they were individually. Collectively, it was a way of blocking communist expansion. And it was also, I should say, a firm rebuke against the isolationism of the 1930s. But once the Cold War ended in 1990/1991, the West became, I would argue, a bit complacent when it came to threats that could come from the East, particularly in the European front. And as you know from Dr. Moore's talk, that hardly democracy resulted in the fall of communism in the former Soviet Union. A very, very rough transition from communism to what it is today. And the balance of power in the world right now is starting to shift away from Western democracies. China, Russia, who've essentially created a non-aggression treaty with each other, have begun to alter that balance in the world. And that is a very clear, direct threat to democracies in the West. At the same time, another powerful wave of isolationism has broken in the United States. President Trump's foreign policy slogan of America First, as I've already explained, was not original. That emerged in the 1930s in response to fascism and totalitarianism that was developing in Europe. But it's become another powerful force again in 2022, with Americans not entirely sure that we need to get involved in any way. But just like in the 1930s, it was a mistake. It's a mistake now. Russia has been very, very effective in waging a covert war against Western democracies, and particularly the United States. It's an indisputable fact that Russia has meddled in 2 presidential elections. Russia is very good at sowing disinformation in social media and the news that a lot of people take as gospel truth, which is very, very dangerous. And now, of course, he's moved into an overt war against a democracy, Ukraine. Ukraine very much wants to be a part of the NATO umbrella, and surely it's clear to us right now why they desperately wanted to be a part of NATO. Russia has invaded them. And as I'm sure you know if you're paying attention to the news, on Sunday, Putin announced that he had escalated his nuclear forces to be on alert. And he has threatened, veiled and directly, any country that intervenes militarily on behalf of Ukraine. Interestingly, Sweden and Finland, who are not members of NATO, have within the last week sped up their process of considering being a part of NATO. They've decided that this might be something that they want to do. And in response to that, Putin said, quote, "There will be a military response," end quote. This is the closest we've come to a nuclear war since the Cold War ended, and even before the Cold War ended. And it's worth pointing out, not to scare people, but to make this, to give some perspective, that the United States and Russia both have 90% of all the nuclear weapons on the planet between the 2 countries. There is a lot at stake. What does it have to do with the United States? Well, obviously, the threat of nuclear war affects every single person on the planet. But a lot of people aren't really sure that Ukraine matters to us here in the United States. A politician running for election in Ohio famously said about a week and a half ago, quote, "I don't really care what happens to Ukraine," end quote. He should care, and we should care, because Ukraine is a new democracy that has clearly and forcefully turned away from Russia and towards the West. And while it's not a member of NATO, Ukraine is on the front line of a war against democracies by an authoritarian oligarch. Where does Putin's aggression end? Well, we don't know the answer to that, but I would say that Hitler promised to behave after he annexed Czechoslovakia on the eve of World War II. He said, I'm done, this is all I want. And everybody said, that's great, went home, peace in our time. We believed him. There are some signs of hope. I want to leave you with some things to think about. It's pretty grim, but there are some things that we can think about. And the first one is that I think it's clear that Putin is scared of NATO. Obviously, he's threatening any country that decides that it wants to join NATO. That's actually, to me, a sign of hope, because it means that NATO serves as a check on his expansionist tendencies, to quote George Kennan. And here's something else that I think it's really important for us to think about. There is no reason for Putin to fear Ukraine's membership in NATO or any other country unless he has imperial designs on those countries. The sanctions, this is another sign of hope, have gotten increasingly stringent in the last week. They started off small, and now they're very, very serious, and they are beginning to crumple the Russian economy. You know it's serious when Switzerland, famously neutral in all things, particularly banking, has agreed that it needs to join in the banking boycott of Russian banks. What's changed? So why did we have sort of more mild sanctions at the beginning of the invasion to very, very stringent sanctions now? This is the thing that makes me very excited. I think it's clear that the mass support of everyday people in the United States, in Western European countries, has put tremendous pressure on Western European leaders to become more aggressive in their sanctions. For example, Berlin was going to have a march to support Ukraine. They were expecting 10 to 20,000 people to come. In fact, 100,000 people came. The spread of the story of the Ukrainian resistance on social media has emboldened the average citizen to protest more, to demand more of their governments to do something about what's happening in Ukraine. This is democracy in action, and I find that incredibly beautiful. We have not seen this kind of groundswell of pressure from ordinary citizens to change their government's policies in a very, very long time. The people of the West need to stand behind the Ukrainians who are fighting for their freedom. And it's nice to see that Western politicians are being pushed farther and farther into that by their own people. So what can we do about this? Well, it's easy to feel helpless. It's easy to doom scroll. It's easy to rage post. I'm guilty of doing all of those things in the last week, but ultimately that's not very helpful. We live in a democracy, and everyone in this room who's 18 or older, you can vote, you can contact your senators. Chris Murphy and Richard Blumenthal are very powerful senators. In fact, Chris Murphy is on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Email his office to tell him what you think about the situation in Ukraine and where you think the United States should stand there. We also need to be prepared for pain. I don't think we want to hear that, but I think it's important that we talk about that. It's very clear that gas prices, energy prices are going to escalate in the United States. They already have started to do so. It's also worth pointing out that it's going to be worse for Europeans than it is going to be for us because they're far more dependent on Russian energy than we are. We also need to be prepared for the price of goods to go up because the supply chain that we've all been witnessing falling apart for a while is probably going to get worse as these sanctions get more and more serious. And I'm also not, I would not be surprised to see cyber attacks, and we need to be prepared for those as well, and for the discomfort that comes from losing internet connectivity, etc. But our pain pales in comparison to Ukraine's, and that's worth reiterating. It pales in comparison to what the Ukrainians are facing. It really hit home to me seeing a 58-year-old history professor being roped into the front lines to fight against the Russians. You also see 60-year-old women, you see children and women making Molotov cocktails to defend their cities. And they need us to not abandon them because we don't want to tighten our belts or to do without temporarily. I think that's worth thinking about. Because Putin is convinced that the West is too lazy and spoiled and decadent to endure whatever pain is coming from these sanctions. Don't let Putin be correct. Be prepared for those sacrifices. And I also think that we need to honor the thousands of Russians who are literally risking their lives to protest what their own government is doing. We have the ability to protest without fear of imprisonment. But these protesters in Russia are being rounded up, thrown into jails. People with children strapped to them are being rounded up, arrested, and thrown into jails. It is not a democracy. We are a democracy. We can protest. We can hold vigils. In fact, I think there is one at 5:30 today in front of the Wyndham Town Hall for Ukraine, if you're interested in attending that. And I think that today you've done a really important thing by coming here to learn a little bit more about a history that perhaps was unfamiliar to you. And that is to be commended, because it's important to educate yourselves on this region and why this country that you've never thought about much has such significance for us in the United States. So please keep that up. Read centrist news sources, read multiple news sources, and all the while be very, very aware that Russia is very good at misinformation. Ask experts around you what they think. You are students at a public liberal arts university. Ask your professors around you who know things about history, about political science, about human behavior, about sociology, what they think about these topics. It's a great time to be at a university that values students asking questions, and ask those questions. Use us as a resource. This is what Eastern has to offer you. And then most importantly, I think I would end by saying that you need to stay engaged. It's really easy to check out and think that this doesn't really matter, but democracy dies on apathy. If you are not paying attention, you can lose your democracy. And I want to end by telling you a very famous story about the Constitutional Convention that was being held in Philadelphia. The Articles of Confederation had failed. A new government was being written. Benjamin Franklin was walking down the street that day in Philadelphia when a woman stopped him on the street and said, "Mr. Franklin, do you have a government for us?" To which he replied, "I do, madam, if you can keep it." Thank you. So I think it's important, as I was saying before, that the world power is beginning to shift in terms of China and Russia teaming up together. China very much wants Taiwan back. So it's looking at what's happening with Russia and Ukraine very, very interestedly. And I think that's an important lesson for the West too, because it's not just about Ukraine, it's also about aggressive larger countries grabbing back or grabbing countries that they want. So I think China's paying very close attention to how we in the West are responding to this aggression. But at the same time, it also, for example, signed an enormous deal to import Russian wheat, because the Russian wheat market has obviously been sanctioned. So it's going out of its way economically to help Russia. Dr. Moore, do you want to add anything to that?
It seems that China is definitely trying to walk a tightrope to also keep connections and especially economic connections to the European Union and the United States, while also obviously trying to give whatever support they can to Russia at the same time. And this is much more in the field of Dr. Keranen, but if you look at the history of the Cold War and since, Russia and China have a very tumultuous relationship that I think also colors this, where they both want to support the authoritarian ambitions of each other, but not be too dependent on each other at the same time, which means that Chinese policy is probably going to be exceptionally murky when it comes to dealing with this.
Do I speak into the mic?
Yeah.
Hey, so I have a quick, I have to go to class in a bit, but I had a quick question. I remember reading a while back and talking with people about this, how the U.S. and NATO kind of violently bombed Yugoslavia in the 90s for 78 days straight. And I want to know, do you guys have any more information on that?
So the war in Yugoslavia was, or as Yugoslavia collapsed, was a very bloody civil war that broke into fairly substantial and horrific genocides occasionally, and actually lasted almost the entire length of the 90s in various stages. And so when it comes to NATO actions, they were largely designed to figure out a way to end ethnic violence that was killing thousands of people. And the goal was to basically end a regime in control of Serbia at the time that was committing some of the worst atrocities and human rights violations since the Second World War ended. And so in that regard, NATO's actions were largely geared toward effort to try to end that civil war and that conflict.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't add anything more than that, yeah. As strange as it is to say, the bombing was in fact an attempt to end a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, because I just remember reading that like a lot of like civilians were killed in that. So I was like wondering like what was going on behind all that.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't an attempt to kill civilians. It was an attempt to end a regime in Serbia that was committing genocide.
All right,
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Of course.
Hi, how's it going? So I had a quick question, well, not really a quick question, but with Russia's history of political instability, especially in the early 20th century, as more and more information comes out on Putin's actions within other countries and within Russia itself, and the more and more protests that are happening in Moscow at the moment, is there a possibility of an uprising coming from the Russian people, something that could happen in the near future that may or may that could be led by Western countries like the U.S., who would like to see Putin out of power?
I hope so. I think that is more likely now than ever before. And in part, that is because I have been surprised by the thousands of Russians, particularly in their 20s and teens, who have taken to the streets to protest the government. And they're feeling the pain of the sanctions. That's the unfortunate thing about sanctions. For example, I saw a news story about how Google Pay and Apple Pay have stopped operations in Russia. And so ordinary Russians trying to use that to ride the subway were backed up, into the streets, trying to scramble to find cash. Daily trauma like that is going to lead to instability. And I think that's something that Putin fears deeply, as Dr. Moore explained. I think the signs are positive, but I would never want to predict the future. I'll let Dr. Moore add his comments.
I famously have always said that historians should never predict the future. And that, I think of sort of our ability to understand things as a profession is to sort of see the inflection points of moments. And there's lots of different possibilities that you can never predict. But I will say that if you had asked that question to me a month ago, I would have thought you were insane because Vladimir Putin had such unquestioned control over Russia. I do think that there's evidence that he's very concerned about his control over power. It's worth pointing out, I didn't exactly use this terminology, but his authoritarian state is also what's called a kleptocracy, meaning the point of people in power is to basically pillage their economy and country for everything they can get. The people around him, the people that manage his state, the people that govern Russia, are in it to have $400 million yachts in the French Riviera, to have $10 million penthouses in Miami. Their goal is to live as big of a life as possible, as long as possible. And I'm sure he has to be worried what's happening now that their actions or their ability to live that life is now under threat. Similarly, as I mentioned several times, I would argue the thing he's most afraid of is what happened in 1989 to 1991, this idea of people being able to demonstrate any sort of power. And I would argue that while we certainly don't know if that could happen, I think it's possible. But it's one of several possibilities. I would also point out that, or sort of say that as hopeful as that may make us, it also is very dangerous because that is when he will be at his most dangerous, when he has nothing left to lose. And we have to be very concerned about that. There's a temptation or a tendency among authoritarian leaders, the longer they're in power, the more isolated they get from people that can give them good advice. The longer they stop actually believing advice, the more they start believing their own propaganda. And I think it's really obvious if you look at his behavior. He's at that stage where he largely doesn't think anybody can tell him anything. And you couple that with paranoia and concern about the potential of losing power, either within his own circle or from the sort of uprising you're talking about. And I think that that is a dangerous moment that hopefully can be managed. And so hope, but also concern.
Gotcha. One more question, if that's all right, with the amount of sanctions that are coming out within the U.S. and other European nations, what kind of repercussions can we see coming down the line because of this in the next month, few months, even the next year of these sanctions happening?
For us or for them?
Anyone. For us, I would say more importantly, because we're living in the U.S. and just in general for the state of the world, what are these sanctions going to be changing within the next months coming up?
Well, I think in the United States, as I mentioned, we need to be prepared for pain. It's going to hurt. The gas prices are going to go up. That's going to hurt, our budgets, our money. I think that prices of goods are going to go up, certainly. And as I said before, I think we need to be prepared for cyber attacks. I remember, a few months ago, Facebook went down and everybody lost their minds because it was like a day or something. We need to be prepared for that to happen and not lose our minds. In terms of larger sanctions, larger implication of sanctions, energy is a big issue, particularly for Europe. The fact that Germany has agreed to cut the pipeline, I think is incredibly brave, but it's also going to mean a lot of pain. And I think we're not used to feeling that kind of pain.
And also, I think you can see food prices go up, and that's probably going to happen even without sanctions because Ukraine's a major grain producer for the world. And while the United States may not be that dependent on Ukrainian grain and foodstuffs, the rest of the world is, and as prices go up because of that, it'll affect us here too. And again, that would happen regardless of the sanctions. But and there's also the possibility, as important as Russian energy is, which is essential to their economy, there's also a bunch of other minerals and sort of raw materials that they provide for things that we use, and so we might see those creep up too. But I want to reiterate what Dr. Kiernan ended on. I would argue that's a pain that's worth having to secure democracies. And I think for too long, and I think this is especially true in Europe, governments made a devil's bargain that it was worth tolerating a openly anti-democratic government in Russia that was becoming increasingly dangerous because they economically benefited from the resources that Russia could provide them. And I think that that's a dangerous trade-off because it's very clear that Russia has no intention of sitting by as one of equal nations eager to just be part of a partnership. That it's a very old-fashioned way of seeing the world that isn't going to just continue to provide those resources and respect the system that we have. And so it's, I think, a sacrifice that's essential.
Got you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kiernan and Dr. Moore. I've been swayed to support Ukraine through mostly an emotional argument. But the idea of autocracy versus democracy, during the Cold War, you had people like General Pinochet who were, it was an authoritarian dictatorial state, but they were someone who was allied with the West. And as far as I can tell, looking at this from a realpolitik perspective, I have a hard time seeing why Russia is a threat to us. We have nuclear weapons. We're much more powerful than them. We have a very strong economy. So while I've been swayed to support Ukraine because of the emotional argument, and I really want to put Putin in his place and show that the U.S. is powerful and active. But when I try and look at it from cold self-interest, calculating, I have a hard time making that rational argument. And I'd be very interested if you could lay out the practical, rational, self-interested reasons for doing so. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, I like the realpolitik reference. So I think that, there is obviously an emotional pull. I talked about how much it mattered to me seeing, people like me being drafted into the front lines. But apart from the emotion, and we should look at it rationally, I agree with you. The rationality is that Ukraine is a new democracy. And if other democracies abandon that democracy, the consequences can be very, very real. Putin is not stopped with Ukraine. There's no reason he will stop with Ukraine. In other words, if we don't stop him here, if Ukraine doesn't stop him there, there's no guarantee that he's done. That was the analogy I was making to Hitler and appeasement. I'm done with Czechoslovakia, we're good, right? That wasn't the case. And that becomes a very real threat to the United States, not just because Russia has nuclear weapons, but because we are members of NATO. And if a NATO country is pulled into this conflict, we are pulled into this conflict. And I would also say that democracy is a fine thing, and I don't want to lose it. And I see already the fact that Putin has meddled in US elections, that Russia is fantastically good at misinformation on social media. Those things are immediate and real threats to our democracy right now.
And I would also add that as much as we can feel secure because we have a powerful economy and a powerful military, so much of our world now depends on a degree of openness and cooperation to maintain the very life that you're talking about. And if the world shifts away from a system that recognizes the intrinsic sovereignty of people to control their own destiny and slides back to a world where great powers can carve up spheres of influence, there's nothing then, once that order collapses, to have Russia or whoever else is engaged in it doing things like holding their economic resources or using their economic resources to hold markets hostage. In other words, if Putin manages to secure this new worldview, what's to stop him from telling Europe, fine, I will shut off all of the resources I give you, and essentially use economic and strategic blackmail. And also, if we're thinking about global prosperity and global economic success, if the world devolves back to one of chronic instability and warfare, that ends the ability to trade openly, to have common economic prosperity. And so, as much as I would say democracy is worth fighting on principle, the world we've lived in is largely the byproduct of the stable order that has been put into place after the Cold War. That it's based off of the reality of countries respecting the rights of other countries to exist. And so in that regard, even though Ukraine may seem peripheral and not a threat to us or not a concern to us, if this level, it's not just the aggression against Ukraine, it's the fact that Putin has basically declared the post-Cold War order is dead and he's trying to create a new one. And then what's to stop China from saying, well, if that's the game now? And then what's to stop other countries who have historic grievances or manipulate their history to exploit them?
Thank you, Dr. Kiernan. Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Okay.
Hello, I just wanted to ask, do you think that China or any other countries are going to support Russia in cyber warfare?
Cyber warfare, that's an interesting question. I do think that one of the pleasantly surprising outcomes of the past few days has been that Russia is largely isolated now on the world stage. And if you look at who they're relying on for support, it's other pariah nations like Iran in the UN. And when it comes to, I think, China with their capabilities, I'm not saying China won't involve or engage in cyber warfare on its own initiative, but I don't know if they'll try to do it in collusion of support of Russia, because I think they're going to try to thread the needle of not antagonizing the current bloc that is opposing Russia.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I'm not an expert on cyber attacks, but I would agree with Dr. Moore that I don't see Russia and China openly cooperating in cyber warfare against the West.
Though they might do it totally on their own.
Right. That's not to say that China wouldn't do that, independently, but probably not at this moment, I would imagine. Sure.
Any other questions? We have time for probably, I guess, one or two more.
So, based off of the actions that Russia has done, what can we see as a punishment to Russia besides sanctions? Because, it was an unprovoked invasion, and there has been a considerable number of, civilian casualties. So what can the world actually, charge Russia with after this conflict ends?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned civilian casualties because I think that we are going to see it get way, way worse. And in fact, in the last 24 hours we have, Dr. Moore was talking about a couple of different weapons, cluster bombs, and what was the other one?
Vacuum bombs.
Vacuum bombs that have been confirmed by the U.S. ambassador to the UN that Russia is using. Both of those are outlawed by war.
Okay, yeah.
So the question is, will we be able to prosecute Putin for war crimes when this is over or while this is happening? I'm not sure how we would do that right now, but there are definitely a stack of war crimes indictments coming their way already, just based on starting an unprovoked war, invading another sovereign country, and then the use of particularly unconventional weapons that are banned by international law.
And, I don't even want to describe to all of you what those bombs do. You can look it up. It's horrifying. And they only are designed to kill civilians. They have no strategic value at all. And I'm not an expert on human rights violations or human rights law. But as a historian, I can tell you, if you go back to one of the first war crimes trials, the Nuremberg trials, the number one charge was launching unprovoked wars of aggression. And so just simply the act of invading Ukraine in the way he did, I would argue, is the definition of a war crime. I do think if you're asking what more can we do, beyond sanctions, I think we have to look into supporting Ukraine as much as we can. It's very obvious they're willing to fight, and I think that's part of the reason why you've seen the reaction that the world has given, because we've all been almost embarrassingly ashamed for how little support we gave them before. And I think providing the military support is absolutely essential to make sure they have the tools they need to fight back against one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. But beyond that, I mean, nobody can advocate intervention militarily just because of the degree to which that would threaten global security.
And just one more question. So with the unification that's been going on in Ukraine, they have paramilitary groups and civilian populations picking up arms against Russians. So how can we look at that in a big world term, with Russians then now fighting? Would those civilians then be considered associated with the military now? Or how would we look at that?
Probably the same you would look at, let's say, a guerrilla movement or insurgent movement. Because I'm sure there will be, regardless of what happens, some form of insurgency operating along a sort of more conventional military.
Thanks.
Dr. Moore, I've noticed your shirt and tie are a Ukrainian flag, and I appreciate it. So one of the motivations I've seen that's very likely for Putin's actions is the impression that there has been Western subversion in Ukrainian elections. So in 2014, we could portray it as an opposition between the Russian government and the civilians of Ukraine who prefer democracy. But from a neutral standpoint, how could you be sure that, or what is an argument against a push between the West and Russia in Ukrainian elections? Are Putin's fears of Western subversion unfounded, and can we make an argument for that?
I would say that we've openly supported democratic movements. It's never been covert in Ukraine. I think Putin is delusional in his justification. I don't think that there is evidence that it's a great Western conspiracy against Russia. He simply sees democratic countries as uncontrollable and therefore a threat to Russia.
And when it comes to Western subversion, I think that it's certainly clear that the West has supported the pro-democratic movements. But that's very different from, let's say, the support Russia gives, which is outright rigging of elections. In 2014, for example, there's evidence that the Russians were engaged in election rigging to the point where somebody who would have gotten less than 5% of the vote could have been declared the winner. And that's very, very different from lending moral support and sort of rhetorical support, economic support, which is sort of what countries do all the time, as opposed to active intervention. And the last thing that I'll say is that when we listen to sort of Putin's argument that NATO is a threat to him. And that's something that's said all the time, that Ukraine is drifting to NATO and the EU, and that is a direct threat to the security of Russia. The only reason NATO is a threat to Russia is because Putin rejects the principle that nations have control over their own sovereignty and rejects the idea that there can be an international community where nations are partners in greater prosperity rather than the domination of their neighbors. If Putin were committed to a stable, successful, prosperous Russia that participated in the rest of Europe when it came to trade, economic activity, political engagement, NATO wouldn't be a threat. In fact, if you want to think about how almost optimistically naive the 90s were, there were even talks in the 90s of Russia joining NATO because the old Cold War divisions were so over that Europe was bound toward a destiny of unification. And I think, ultimately, if you were to look at the protests that are going on in Russia now, it's people your age that are basically saying we would prefer to have a more open society where we aren't sort of beholden to sort of this obviously corrupt regime.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I'm delighted to see people that are concerned and interested and want to know more. And as I said in my remarks, don't hesitate to ask your professors from lots of different disciplines what they think about what's happening, because, as I said before, studying history, studying politics, studying human behavior, it is all relevant to what's happening right now. And I hope that we've provided you with a little bit of context to understand the news reports that you're seeing. And thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.